I found my 15-year-old son lying unconscious on our own front lawn, his body shattered, his face bloodied, and two men dressed like cops standing over him. But they weren't real cops. They were fake HOA enforcers with badges they made at home. And now, after what they did to my boy, they're facing life in prison. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Saturday morning. The kind of day where the sun spills in lazy streaks through the trees, and the only thing anyone should worry about is whether the coffee pot's working. My 15-year-old son had just stepped out onto our front lawn, something he'd done hundreds of times before, wearing his old sneakers and clutching a bag of trash he was taking to the bin near the driveway. That lawn, that driveway, we owned every inch of it, paid for it, maintained it. Nobody had ever questioned our right to walk freely on our own property, but this time was different. Two men, dressed in navy blue tactical pants, utility belts, and black polo shirts with bold white lettering that read Community Enforcement, were already standing near the edge of our yard. I didn't recognize either of them. Their posture, their expressions, it was off. Authoritarian, cold, eyes scanning like predators looking for a reason. The kind of posture meant to intimidate, not protect. One of them barked something at my son. He turned, confused, frozen for a second. Then the shouting started. They accused him of trespassing on our lawn. He said it was his home. He pointed at the house. But they didn't care. One of them pulled out what looked like a citation book. The other reached for his belt like he was ready to escalate things. That's when they told him, loud enough for a neighbor to overhear, that he was in violation of HOA regulations and was being detained for resisting directives. The words made zero sense. This wasn't a shopping mall. This wasn't a private HOA office. This was our front yard. He tried to walk away. That's all he did. One step backward, trying to remove himself from a confrontation. And that's when it all went downhill. Fast. One of them grabbed his arm. The other shoved him hard in the chest. No warning. No explanation. They took him down like he was a suspect in a felony takedown, slammed him into the grass. His head hit the side of the sidewalk on the way down. His legs kicked, flailing. He screamed in pain, trying to tell them he couldn't move, but they didn't stop. One had his knee on his back, the other kept shouting legal-sounding gibberish like "stop resisting" and "you're under HOA detention protocol." It was a performance, a sick, twisted power play. But my son wasn't acting. He was in agony. They never called for medical help. They never checked to see if he was conscious. They didn't even realize what they had done. One of our neighbors came running over, yelling for them to stop. They told her to stay back for her own safety. Another neighbor took out a phone and started recording. That's when the fake cops started to look nervous. They suddenly became silent, glanced at each other, and slowly backed away, leaving my son on the lawn like a discarded object. Limp, motionless, barely breathing. They didn't stay to explain. They didn't offer a name, a badge number, a department, or even a contact for the HOA. They just walked off, got into an unmarked black SUV, and drove away like nothing had happened. It was only after an actual emergency response team arrived, thanks to the neighbor who dialed 911, that we started to grasp the damage. My son was drifting in and out of consciousness. His left leg was visibly bent the wrong way. One arm was tucked under him at an unnatural angle. His face was scraped raw, and blood was trickling from a gash above his eyebrow. The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance while I tried to process what I had just witnessed. I kept asking the same question over and over again. Who the hell were those guys? And more importantly, who gave them the right to assault my child in front of our home? The HOA, apparently. Or, at least, that's who they claimed to be with. These weren't police officers. They weren't deputies or marshals or city inspectors. They were just two men authorized or maybe just allowed by the local HOA to patrol the neighborhood. No law enforcement oversight. No training. No background checks. Just men with cheap uniforms, clip-on badges, and unchecked authority over families like mine. And in their delusion of power, they'd crossed a line that would change everything. My son wasn't trespassing. He was bleeding out in our front yard, and I was just getting started, The hospital room felt colder than it should have. The sterile walls and humming machines did nothing to soften the blow of what the doctors told us. 28 bones. That's how many were broken. Not fractured, not bruised, broken, like he'd been hit by a car or thrown down a flight of stairs. But this wasn't an accident. This was the result of two grown men violently slamming a teenage boy into the ground again and again because they thought they could. The X-rays looked more like a shattered sculpture than a human body. Multiple ribs were fractured, some completely splintered. One had come dangerously close to puncturing his lung. His right femur, the strongest bone in the human body, was snapped clean in two, a break so severe the attending trauma specialist said he hadn't seen one like it outside of high-impact collisions. His left wrist was crushed, likely from trying to shield his face during the assault. His collarbone was broken, and his face, his orbital bone was cracked, leaving one eye almost swollen shut. Purple, red, and yellow discoloration spread across his face like someone had taken a brush and painted bruises across every inch. The doctors were trying to stay composed, but even they were visibly disturbed. They asked us more than once if this had been a vehicular accident. They asked if he'd fallen from a significant height. When we told them it was an altercation on flat ground, with two men claiming to be HOA security, the room fell silent. One nurse muttered, "That's not possible," and walked out of the room with her hand over her mouth. There was nothing routine about his treatment. They had to bring in orthopedic surgeons, trauma specialists, and a pediatric neurology consultant. He was given strong sedatives to manage the pain that still made him scream every time they touched his leg. He couldn't sit up, couldn't speak properly, could barely keep his eyes open. And underneath all that medication, he was terrified. Every time a uniform walked into the room, his heart monitor would spike. His eyes would dart around the room like he was reliving the moment again. The police arrived not long after. Real police, not HOA thugs in homemade uniforms. They took our statements. They reviewed what little footage we had from a neighbor's security camera. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough to show two men tackling a teenage boy, then continuing to press and strike him while he was already on the ground. The audio didn't pick up much, but you could hear the impact. You could hear him screaming. The officer's expressions hardened. This wasn't a case of excessive force. This was outright assault. That's when we began asking questions. Who were these men? Where did they come from? Were they hired by the HOA? Were they licensed? Certified? Trained? The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. They weren't law enforcement. Not even close. They didn't work for the city, county, or any recognized security agency. They had no legal authority. Their badges were nothing more than laminated plastic cards with a fake department logo that said Community Compliance Division. Their vehicle had emergency lights, but no registration. Their uniforms were unbranded. One of them had previously worked security at a local grocery store. The other had been fired from a private contractor role for, ironically, excessive aggression. And yet, the HOA had hired them, not through a firm, not through any kind of vetting process, but by word of mouth and a handshake agreement made behind closed doors. They weren't officers. They were volunteers, people given unofficial enforcement roles by the HOA board president with vague instructions to keep the community in line. No oversight, no accountability, just permission to roam the neighborhood like vigilantes with clipboards and tactical gear. And worst of all, this wasn't their first incident. Other residents began coming forward. Stories surfaced of harassment, intimidation, threats of fines for minor infractions. One elderly couple said they were followed to their mailbox and told they were under surveillance. A teenage girl had reportedly been stopped while jogging and accused of unauthorized loitering. But no one had been hurt, until now. It took my son nearly dying for anyone to finally pay attention. That's when the HOA tried to distance themselves. The board claimed these men acted outside the scope of their roles, that they were not authorized to detain anyone. But documents began surfacing, meeting notes, emails, Photos of these men standing beside board members at community events, wearing the same uniforms, flashing the same fake badges. The HOA hadn't just allowed this, they'd empowered it. They gave amateurs authority. And my son paid the price. That's when I found out they were just HOA volunteers playing dress up as police. The first meeting with the HOA board happened just 2 days after my son's emergency surgery. They didn't come to the hospital. They didn't reach out. They sent a generic email titled Incident Involving Community Enforcement Personnel, which read more like a corporate liability memo than a human response to a violent assault. It didn't mention my son by name. No apology. No accountability. Just a carefully worded message about an unfortunate escalation involving community safety officers. That's what they called it, an unfortunate escalation. I showed up to the board meeting furious but composed. I had the footage from the neighbor's security cam. I had printed stills showing my son on the ground, arms covering his face, while 2 grown men pinned him like he was a threat. When I started presenting the evidence, the room got uncomfortably quiet. No one interrupted me. No one asked questions. They just stared, stone-faced and detached, like I was reading off grocery list items instead of describing a brutal assault on a child. And then the HOA president spoke. He leaned forward, laced his fingers on the table, and said the words that made my blood boil. "We believe your son was resisting a lawful order from our community officers. The situation only escalated because he failed to comply." It took everything in me not to flip the table. He doubled down, claimed the officers were operating within their rights, said they had been instructed to ensure that non-compliant behavior on HOA property was addressed promptly and with necessary authority. I reminded him, in no uncertain terms, that the incident happened on my front lawn, property clearly documented as private and not under HOA jurisdiction. He smirked. Then he said, "The boundaries can be confusing. We'll look into it." That's when I realized they weren't just avoiding responsibility. They were preparing a cover-up. They were trying to spin this. Minutes after the meeting, I got a call from a local HOA attorney, not a representative of the police, not a child welfare advocate, an attorney. She said the HOA would strongly recommend resolving the situation privately. She hinted at a settlement offer, then threatened that if I went public with my accusations, they would pursue a defamation lawsuit against me for damaging the HOA's reputation. Let that sink in. My son had been hospitalized with 28 broken bones, and they were threatening to sue me. I asked her if she'd seen the footage. She said she couldn't comment on ongoing internal matters. I asked her if she had children. She ended the call. That night, they posted an official statement to the community board, a full-page notice titled Clarification Regarding Recent Neighborhood Incident. It said there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding between community compliance volunteers and a resident. They stated that the individuals involved were cooperating with an internal review and that all actions taken had been within the scope of their appointed roles. Appointed. That word stuck in my mind. Who appointed them? Who gave them permission to act like law enforcement? Where was the documentation? The training? The liability coverage? I started digging. What I found made my stomach turn. The HOA president had bypassed the normal hiring process to bring in trusted friends to serve as community enforcement officers. No background checks. No insurance. No oversight. One of them had previously been sued for assault. The other had posted videos online boasting about taking control of lazy neighborhoods. They weren't hired for safety, they were hired for intimidation. Worse, the board had been warned. A resident had submitted a formal complaint just weeks earlier about aggressive conduct by uniformed men claiming HOA authority. That complaint was dismissed. The minutes from the board meeting show the president laughing and calling it paranoia. They knew. They knew something like this could happen, and they did nothing to stop it. When it did happen, they circled the wagons. They tried to bury it under legal threats and vague language. They tried to blame a kid, my kid, for getting beaten within an inch of his life. That was their strategy: deny, delay, deflect. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't some scared, quiet homeowner they could bully into silence. I wasn't about to accept hush money or let them spin their version of events to the community. My son had a long road to recovery ahead of him. Multiple surgeries, months of rehab, PTSD that still kept him up at night. And they were out here, writing press releases. They thought it was over. They thought they had it contained. They didn't realize I had spent 20 years working in a legal field. They didn't know I had contacts. They didn't know I kept receipts. So I walked out of that meeting burning inside, not with rage, but with purpose. And I made one phone call that turned this whole case upside down. One call. That's all it took to shift the storm in the opposite direction. The moment the right people got involved, the game changed. Silence became noise. Cover-ups turned into criminal investigations. The HOA board, once arrogant and dismissive, suddenly went quiet. Because the name I dropped on that call wasn't just a friend, it was someone with authority. Real authority. And when they heard what happened to my son, they didn't wait for permission. The first thing to hit was federal attention. The moment someone uttered the words impersonating law enforcement combined with assault resulting in grievous bodily harm, red flags lit up all over the system. It wasn't just a local case anymore. Federal agencies took interest because the men weren't merely acting outside their authority, they were actively impersonating officers of the law. That's a federal crime. And when combined with what happened to a minor, it carried teeth. Investigators from a federal task force began collecting everything: internal emails, security footage, prior complaints, personnel rosters from the HOA. They subpoenaed phone records and financial transactions. And once they started turning over stones, the rot underneath spilled out like sewage. The men who assaulted my son didn't just have shady backgrounds, they had records. One had been discharged from a previous security firm for misconduct involving excessive force. The other had ties to a self-styled militia group known for community patrols. Both had been flagged in past complaints for harassment and threats. Neither had proper certification. Neither had passed any form of psychological screening. Yet both had been issued authority by the HOA board to enforce compliance with zero checks. Then came the media. A local reporter picked up the story after hearing whispers from a hospital staffer who was disturbed by the extent of the injuries. From there, it exploded. Local news ran the headline, "Teen hospitalized after beating by fake HOA cops." Within 24 hours, national outlets were involved. Reporters camped outside the HOA office. Cameras rolled on live broadcasts while neighbors shouted through bullhorns. Public opinion flipped overnight. The same board that once ruled the neighborhood like royalty was now dodging microphones and hiding behind tinted SUV windows. The public outrage reached critical mass when a leaked video surfaced. One of the HOA meetings had been secretly recorded by a board member who'd grown uncomfortable with how things were being handled. In that video, the president openly bragged about taking enforcement into our own hands and making examples out of rule breakers. He mocked residents who questioned the patrols. He even referred to my son as that mouthy punk. The footage aired during a primetime news slot, and by the end of the broadcast, social media was on fire. What started as local frustration became a movement. The neighborhood that once passively accepted the HOA's rule now turned on them. Residents filed formal petitions. Dozens requested to suspend dues. Some ripped down HOA signage and began organizing independent security forums. Protesters lined the sidewalks outside the HOA office. Parents stood with their children, holding signs that said things like "Justice for Jacob" and "Fake cops don't belong in our neighborhood." Meanwhile, federal agents kept digging. Financial audits exposed misappropriated funds, dues that had been diverted into private accounts. Enforcement spending had no oversight. Equipment had been purchased off the books: tactical vests, radios, even handcuffs. There were allegations of favoritism, bribes, and undeclared gifts between the board and vendors. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they found. The FBI stepped in officially after discovering that the Community Compliance Division badge design used by the fake officers closely resembled an official federal agency's seal. That sealed the deal: impersonating a federal officer. A major felony. The raids came quickly after that. Federal agents executed warrants on the HOA office board members' homes and the fake cops' residences. Computers were seized, phones confiscated, documents boxed up and hauled out in plain view of every camera. Residents watched as the very people who had once written them citations for lawn height and mailbox colors were now being let out in handcuffs. The charges stacked up fast. Aggravated assault, impersonating law enforcement, reckless endangerment, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and fraud. And that wasn't all. Civil suits followed from multiple residents, including families who had previously been threatened or harassed by the so-called officers. The HOA board tried to spin it one last time. Their official statement blamed miscommunication and rogue individuals. But by then, no one was buying it. The board was disbanded. Emergency elections were held. The neighborhood began drafting new bylaws to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. As for the two men who shattered my son's body, they were denied bail. The judge called them a danger to the community and a disgrace to public safety. Their trial was fast-tracked, and prosecutors made it clear they were seeking the maximum penalty under federal law. And just like that, their fake uniforms turned into real orange jumpsuits. The courtroom was filled to capacity during sentencing. Reporters, neighbors, and even former HOA members sat in stunned silence as the charges were read aloud, each one more severe than the last. Aggravated assault of a minor, impersonation of a law enforcement officer, conspiracy to intimidate, civil rights violations. The federal prosecutor didn't hold back, laying out the brutality in forensic detail, piece by piece, until even the defense attorney stopped trying to spin it. The fake officers didn't just use excessive force, they weaponized fear. They operated under the illusion of authority, abused it, and nearly destroyed a family in the process. And the judge didn't blink. He called their actions calculated, criminal, and cowardly. He cited the psychological and physical trauma inflicted on a defenseless teenager. He acknowledged the conspiracy by the HOA board to shield them from justice. Then he handed down the sentence without hesitation: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. It wasn't just justice, it was a message, one that rippled far beyond our neighborhood and into every HOA-run community watching this unfold on the evening news. My son wasn't in a room that day, but his presence was felt in every word of the victim impact statement I delivered. I told them about the surgeries, the plates and screws holding his bones together, the nightmares that jolted him awake at 2 a.m. I told them how he couldn't go outside for months without panicking at the sight of anyone in uniform. I told them how he stopped talking for weeks, not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him had been broken just as surely as his bones. But I also told them about his comeback. Physical therapy became his battleground. Every inch of progress was a war. Every step was a declaration, from being carried out of the hospital in a wheelchair to standing on his own 2 feet with a walker in his hands. It was a victory not just over pain, but over fear. And with each session, each breakthrough, something stronger was being rebuilt. Not just bones, not just tendons, character, grit, fire. The community, once divided and silent, transformed into a source of strength. Neighbors who had never spoken before began showing up with meals, cards, even small donations to cover medical bills. Local kids rallied around my son. They decorated his walker with stickers and wrote messages like, "You're tougher than they are and you got this." It wasn't charity, it was solidarity. They saw the injustice, and they chose to stand on the right side of it. Even the new HOA board, freshly elected and transparent, declared a full overhaul of every rule, policy, and enforcement mechanism. No more rogue patrols. No more unchecked authority. Background checks were mandated for all positions. Public accountability became the new standard. What had once been a bureaucratic power structure was now being reshaped into a real community. All because one act of violence had exposed years of negligence, and the people said never again. As for the two men behind it all, Their lives are now defined by bars, concrete, and the echo of consequences. The bravado they showed on my lawn vanished in court. Their smug sense of power stripped away. They will grow old inside a system they once pretended to represent. And every time they see a guard walk past, every time they hear the click of a cell door, they'll be reminded they didn't just lose their freedom. They lost their identity, their illusion, their legacy. But I didn't walk away unscarred. There's a kind of anger that never fully burns out. A slow, steady ember that stays with you, not out of hate, but out of memory. I carry that now, not with vengeance, but with purpose. Because what happened to my son wasn't just about one rogue HOA or two fake officers. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a culture of unchecked power wrapped in fake badges and neighborhood politics. And I made it clear that it stops here. The last line of my statement wasn't for the judge. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for anyone who ever thinks about stepping into someone's yard and pretending they have the right to do harm. For anyone hiding behind a clipboard, a patch, or a set of bylaws to justify abuse. For every paper tyrant who mistakes fear for control. Mess with my family again, and next time I won't just call the cops. I'll be the law. Because justice isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about what we choose to never allow again. If stories like this shook you, if you believe justice should always overpower power trips, then you're in the right place. This is just one of many real, jaw-dropping HOA tales we uncover here. Bell subscribe to expect stories for more unbelievable confrontations, epic takedowns, and justice served ice cold. We bring you the wildest neighborhood dramas every week. Because in these communities, the truth is stranger than fiction. Don't just watch, expect stories.